Kia ora koutou. The paper today is a co-production by Harvey, who lives in Melbourne, and myself, Lachy Paterson, who are both part of the Preserving Local History and Educational Trust, Te Pupuri I ngā Hītori o te Rohe Trust. Historical research into New Zealand topics is almost unthinkable today without using papers past to read online newspapers. The ready access has allowed researchers to go in different directions, find new stories, and to ask new questions. But Papers Past provides access to only a small subset of all newspapers published in New Zealand. In particular, local community newspapers are not well represented. So in this talk, we want to look briefly at what is happening right now, which can help us reflect on the past. Rachel Smolkin's research, for example, points to the importance of local papers in communities today. Sam Schulhofer-Woll and Miguel Garrido also demonstrate in a working paper on the closure of the Cincinnati Post that less local reporting results in lesser public engagement, and that's by voters as well as candidates. Local newspapers around the world have been under threat in the past decades. As Gavin Ellis in his position paper on the New Zealand media notes, some places have already become news deserts. We can see this with NZME's proposal to axe 14 local community newspapers, and this is a trend that's only likely to continue. Now, this is very sad and maybe inevitable, but would it not also be a tragedy if we go into the future with a similarly reduced digital past? Our Trust's concern is that many communities also face this prospect as we allow gaps to form in our historical record beyond those that already exist. In this talk, we examine two community papers to illustrate their value as historical resources. Ross looks at the Devonport Gazette, which later became the North Shore Gazette, and I'll be discussing the Ruapehu Bulletin, formerly known as the Waimarino Bulletin. And then we conclude with a discussion on the dangers local print archives face and how the Trust is trying to preserve our histories into the future. For those that don't know, Devonport is a harbourside suburb of Auckland. It's also one of the oldest colonial settlements in the city, with the Devonport Naval Base established in 1841. Its location at the end of the North Shore Peninsula means it was isolated from the rest of Auckland except by a ferry or by an arduous road journey, and it still feels separate today. A newspaper reflecting local interest was therefore important for its inhabitants, perhaps more so than other suburbs with more direct road connections. There were several short-lived newspapers established in the area: the Waitemata Messenger in 1885, Waitemata Post, later called the Waitemata News, in 1910, and the Devonport News in the 1930s. But the title investigated today was a much longer-lived weekly, the Devonport Gazette and Greater North Shore Advocate, which began in 1921, then continued on as the North Shore Gazette from November 1924 and running until the late 1940s. Now, the Devonport Gazette was a modest paper, most issues being 4 pages. It was initially distributed free across the Devonport area and later sold for 1 penny an issue. So, published from 1921 to 48, the Gazette was a major newspaper covering the North Shore generally, and Devonport in particular, providing a local perspective on the town in the 1920s and also, to a lesser extent, its neighbouring areas. By 1930, there were just over 20,000 residents across both the urban and rural North Shore, with Devonport its largest centre, until its population was surpassed by Takapuna at the end of the 1950s. As well as advertisements, many for local businesses, community newspapers are well worth studying for what they tell us about local preoccupations. The Gazette's news content initially focused on the Devonport Borough Council and local groups, alongside some coverage of the wider North Shore activities. From 1924, the newspaper widened its focus to include neighbouring areas such as Takapuna, Northcote and Birkenhead, and it also reported on meetings of the Takapuna Borough Council. This extended focus was reflected in the renaming as the North Shore Gazette, the official Waitemata paper. Well, the digitised pages of the Auckland metropolitan dailies, such as the New Zealand Herald, offer a limited coverage of the North Shore events of the 1920s to the 1940s. Access to a more localised coverage across the harbour through the digitisation of these local community newspapers is therefore invaluable to local history researchers, with the reporting on North Shore identities, business and sporting clubs, entertainment options, amongst other things. So we'll provide a few examples of the local contents of this newspaper to illustrate its unique nature and how this publication added to community life. The snippets not only reflect past community activity, but also demonstrate a microcosm of the wider Auckland city at that time. The first issue, on the 3rd of November 1921, billed itself as the Ratepayers Chronicle and Who's Who Directory, effectively further advertising. Particularly prominent were notices for and material about Devonport's local cinema, the Victoria Theatre, which sat right next door to the newspaper's office, and these were to feature throughout the newspaper's life. Other local contents in this first issue include, on page 4, gossip overheard at the Fire Brigade Social, and Buffaloism, reporting on local lodge activities. Now, the North Shore was already covered by newspaper reporters of the Auckland dailies, which were the Auckland Star, the New Zealand Herald, and from 1921 to 1930, the Sun. In addition, there was the weekly New Zealand Truth. Nevertheless, the Gazette's local coverage and advertising was clearly attractive. It was also initially free, unlike the other newspapers. Throughout the 1920s, the major topics reported were transport, such as trams, buses and ferries, and a possible harbour bridge, the water supply, and the developing electricity network. The Gazette also provided a local focus with reporting on sports teams, Devonport and Takapuna Borough Council activities, obituaries of Devonport residents, and local events. Most of the Gazette's copy came from its own reporters, but it also relied quite heavily on material published by other papers. For example, the front page article on the 12th of June 1930 about the Takapuna Borough Council being sued over the failure to make a road was lifted from an earlier issue of The Sun. The North Shore-based advertisers were mostly in Devonport, but advertisements for consumer goods and services offered on the city side are also numerous, emphasising the shopping and employment connection by ferry between Devonport and Auckland City. While there are only 2 missing issues of the Gazette from the 3rd of November 1921 to the 1st of August 1930, only 21 issues for the remaining 18 years have been located. Those from 1934 and 36 cover a time of extended economic depression. For example, we see here a report from the women's branch of the Devonport Unemployed Association in June 1934. Other local insights into world events can be seen in this October 1945 report on the return of a former prisoner of war, a local sports hero, on the ship Dominion Monarch. We can also learn from reading the paper that the Devonport RSA had ambitious post-war plans for developing its premises. There were reports from the Devonport Orphans Club and the Druids, along with those from local rugby, cricket, cycling, swimming, hockey, tennis, golf, soccer and yachting clubs. Details of Devonport weddings, engagements and obituaries continued throughout its run. But with so few extant issues for the 1930s and 40s, writing a history of the North Shore for this period is made much more difficult by the gap. This is a veritable historical news desert. The Preserving Local History and Education Trust has, however, managed to digitise all known surviving issues of this paper. The next paper that we're looking at requires a jump of 40-odd years. That is, when an existing newspaper, the Ruapehu Bulletin, renamed itself as the Ruapehu Bulletin in 1989. The newspaper is still publishing to this day. Now, like any community newspaper, there was a wide range of material in this paper. Advertising figures heavily, about 55% of the total content, which is perhaps not surprising for a free paper. But this first 16-page issue, under the new name, still has space to report on the local kohanga reo, the AMP show, a local health expo, police news, gossip, sport, hunting, fishing, a proposed motel, an army exercise, and the annual desert fair, plus more. But for this case study, I'll be focusing on local politics, all from the same issue. Local councils for Waimarino, Taumarunui and Wauru were established in the 1910s and 20s, but in 1989 they were amalgamated as a result of the fourth Labour government's local body reforms. The newspaper was thus renamed in February to reflect this change, although elections for the new council didn't take place until October. What we can see from this issue is that local political news was of great interest to the paper, and one presumes to its readers as well. We can also see in this transition period that the existing councils are still going about their work, such as the Rangataua sewage scheme, but the impending amalgamation was also causing some anxiety, with local meetings held to discuss the implications and ensure that various districts were not disadvantaged by the changes. Now, all of these articles were in one single issue, but the following issues up until the election also focus keenly on the amalgamation, and in general the newspaper's content was particularly concerned with politics and the lived experience of local people. So, why are these newspapers important? Both the Devonport Gazette and Ruapehu Bulletin, like all small community newspapers, provide historical data at a far greater depth than what might be expected if a city daily was reporting. These newspapers produce stories about issues that affected the readers and about people they probably personally knew. Such papers also have a particular value for a wide range of researchers, whether that's school children undertaking history projects, genealogists and local historians, but also academic historians and other scholars keen to dig a little bit deeper or gain different insights. So we might not be able to stop the current papers from folding, but what if these historical papers just disappeared, such as being sent off to the dump as trash? People might have seen this article about the archived copies of the Gisborne Herald. New owners, the NZME, plan to sell the building that the old papers are stored in, and locals are struggling to find anywhere new to house them. This would of course be very sad if these papers all ended up at the tip, but perhaps not tragic. Why? Because much of this paper has already been digitised and is available on papers past. But this is not the case for a lot of community newspapers that have not been digitised or put onto microfilm. If their hard copies are lost, they disappear forever. Another hole forms in our digital past. Things we might have known about will never now be discovered. Unfortunately, some have already disappeared, some are in real danger, and a lucky few have been rescued at the last moment. An answer, of course, is to digitise the newspapers and put them all on the National Library's Papers Past website. This at least preserves the content, even if the hard copies cannot be conserved. However, only a small fraction of historical newspapers have yet been digitised, and because the National Library has constrained funding, the smaller local community newspapers are not its priority. As a response to this dilemma, the Preserving Local History and Educational Trust has started to digitise at-risk community newspapers in order to save the local stories, culture and history that might otherwise be lost. These we store on our own Recollect site for anyone to access. As we have an agreement with the National Library, we will transfer over the digitised papers to be placed on Papers Past when they are ready to receive them. You can see from the list on the screen that we currently have 8 newspaper titles now available for free public access, including the ones that we've talked about today, and 3 where digitisation is now underway. Of course, as you can imagine, digitising thousands of pages to the standard required for Papers Past is not cheap. Neither is hosting them on our Recollect site. We are fortunate to have received some funding from the New Zealand Lottery Grants Board to help carry on with our work. Indeed, much of the Trust's work is applying for grants, large and small, soliciting donations, and engaging with local stakeholders and heritage institutions. So, for those of you who might want to know more, I will conclude with some further information on the Trust and its work, trying to preserve our local histories and stories, whether it be about cities, towns, or rural areas. And this will be a taonga for future generations. Tēnā rā koutou.